Lesson 4, American History, Civil Rights. This lesson explains the history, tactics, and results of the civil rights movement in the United States. The lesson is divided into 4 sections. The civil rights movement in the United States tried to end racial discrimination. Sometimes called the African American Civil Rights Movement, it went through several stages. The movement began before the Civil War and ended in the late 1960s. The modern phase of the civil rights movement lasted from 1954 until 1968. At that time, other groups in America were also working to gain many of the same rights as African Americans. Together, these diverse groups successfully used the courts and nonviolent protest to end racial segregation, achieve equal voting rights, and greater equality for all Americans. At the end of the Civil War, slavery was outlawed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. However, discrimination against African Americans was very common in all states, and racial segregation was universal in the southern states. In states with segregation, blacks and whites had separate seating areas in buses, trains, movie theaters, and restaurants. There were also separate water fountains, public bathrooms, hospitals, and schools. African Americans also faced discrimination in employment and housing, and in almost every state it was illegal for blacks and whites to marry. The U.S. Constitution sets up the government, defines the government, and protects basic rights of Americans. In this way, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. As the supreme law in the United States, the Constitution is above any state or federal law. Even so, many states, particularly southern states, had laws protecting segregation and other forms of discrimination. This meant African Americans and other minorities were regularly denied rights that were guaranteed everyone living in the United States, including the freedoms of expression, speech, and assembly, as well as the right to petition the government and to bear arms. The Constitution allows changes or additions to be made to it. Such changes to the Constitution are called amendments. As a result of the Civil Rights Movement, several amendments were added to guarantee all Americans the same basic freedoms, particularly in the area of voting. The job of the judicial branch is to review laws, explain laws, resolve disputes, and decide if a law goes against the Constitution. The highest court in the nation is the Supreme Court. As the highest court in the land, its decisions are final and apply to every person and state in the country. Therefore, since African Americans were being denied rights guaranteed by the Constitution, civil rights activists often used the Supreme Court to try to gain their constitutional rights. This is the end of Section 1. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 2. What does the Constitution do? Sets up the government. The Constitution sets up the government, defines the government, and protects basic rights of Americans. Question 4. What is an amendment? An amendment is a change or addition to the Constitution. Question 37. What does the judicial branch do? Decides if a law goes against the Constitution. The judicial branch decides if a law goes against the Constitution. The judicial branch also reviews laws, explains laws, and resolves disputes. Question 38. What is the highest court in the United States? The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. Question 51. What are two rights of everyone living in the United States? Freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Freedom of speech and freedom of assembly are two rights of everyone living in the United States. Some other rights of everyone living in the United States are freedom of expression, freedom to petition the government, freedom of worship, and the right to bear arms. Question 84. What movement tried to end racial discrimination? The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement tried to end racial discrimination. Civil Rights, Section 2. We will now begin the second section of Lesson 4. One risk of using the Supreme Court was the court did not always support the rights of African Americans. For example, in 1857, the court ruled in Scott v. Sanford that people of African descent were not U.S. citizens and therefore not protected by the Constitution. After the Civil War, this was changed by the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that anyone born in the United States, except Native Americans, is automatically an American citizen. Even so, the intent of the amendment was ignored in many states. These states then created what were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws not only made segregation and other forms of discrimination legal, they sometimes required segregation. Some defended segregation by arguing that the 14th Amendment did not prohibit discrimination by individuals. They also argued that segregation created separate but equal facilities and therefore was not in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. For example, there might be separate schools for black and white students, but the schools were said to be of equal quality. Then, in a later case, the Supreme Court agreed that states could not prohibit discrimination by individuals and, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, upheld the idea of separate but equal. Those two decisions made segregation and other forms of discrimination legal throughout the United States, and it would be 70 years before legal segregation was ended. The United States has always been a democracy, but originally, only white male landowners could vote. After slavery was outlawed at the end of the Civil War, the next victory for African Americans came when the 15th Amendment allowed men of any race to vote. However, since the Constitution allows each state to create their own voting rules, states made new laws to keep black men and poor whites from voting. The most common laws required a voter to pass a reading test or to pay a poll tax. This prevented many Americans, both black and white, from voting, and in that way denied them any meaningful political voice. Women were another group who could not originally vote. By 1838, only one state allowed all women to vote. A few other states allowed some women to vote, but activists wanted all women in every state to have the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most famous activists at this time. She fought for women's rights and civil rights, and in 1872 was arrested for illegally voting along with 14 other women. However, only Anthony was arrested, and a judge ordered her to pay a $100 fine. She refused, but because the judge refused to have her arrested for not paying the fine, she could not bring her case to the Supreme Court. 2 years later, the U.S. Congress canceled the fine. However, this small victory did not change the voting laws. In fact, the following year, the Supreme Court declared in a similar case that the Constitution does not guarantee the right to vote to anyone. Still, activists continued to work for women's voting rights, and in 1920, 14 years after Susan B. Anthony died, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. 4 years later, the Snyder Act extended citizenship to Native Americans, and with that, the right to vote. Women got voting rights through nonviolent methods. Most African Americans used the same tactics, in addition to using the Supreme Court. In 1951, a group of activists sued the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. The case Brown versus Board of Education argued that separate but equal did not work because white schools were much better than African American schools. In 1954, all 9 Supreme Court justices agreed and declared separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and therefore in violation of the Constitution. The Supreme Court's decision made school segregation illegal throughout the United States. Despite the Supreme Court's decision, what was now the law of the land, school systems were very slow to desegregate. For example, Little Rock, Arkansas allowed its first 9 African American students into a white high school 6 years later in 1957. These students became known as the Little Rock Nine, and their experience was a serious test for the U.S. government. When the Little Rock Nine tried to enter the white school, Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, used the Arkansas National Guard to stop them. By ignoring the Supreme Court, Governor Faubus was going against a basic principle behind the Constitution, the rule of law. The rule of law means that no one is above the law, and that everyone must obey the law, even leaders and the government. The president at this time was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general during World War II, a time when the U.S. military was completely segregated. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military, so when Faubus refused to protect the black students, President Eisenhower took control of the Arkansas National Guard and replaced them with federal troops. The new soldiers escorted the Little Rock Nine into the school, but the students faced constant harassment and discrimination for the rest of the year. At the end of the school year, Faubus closed all the high schools in Little Rock so there could be no desegregation. The schools then remained closed for a whole year, a period now known as the Lost Year. This is the end of Section 2. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 12. What is the rule of law? The rule of law means no one is above the law. The rule of law means everyone must follow the law, leaders must obey the law, the government must obey the law, and that no one is above the law. Question 32. Who is the commander-in-chief of the military? The President. The President is commander-in-chief of the military. The U.S. military consists of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and National Guard. Question 77. What did Susan B. Anthony do? Fought for women's rights and civil rights. Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights and civil rights. Question 82. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? World War II. President Eisenhower was a general in World War II before he was president. Civil Rights, Section 3. We will now begin the third section of Lesson 4. Although it took several more years, eventually all schools in Little Rock desegregated. In many other cities, though, it took much longer. For instance, on November 14, 1960, U.S. Marshals escorted Ruby Bridges to school in New Orleans, Louisiana. On that day, Bridges became the first black child to enter an all-white elementary school anywhere in the American South. The most important leader in the civil rights movement was Martin Luther King, Jr. He was a Baptist minister who fought for civil rights and worked for equality for all Americans. he believed the civil rights movement could only succeed through nonviolent means. For his work, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. An equally important event from this time was the Montgomery bus boycott. Like many public transit systems, the buses in Montgomery, Alabama required black passengers to sit at the back of the bus. On December 1, 1955, a local activist named Rosa Parks was told to give her seat to a white man. She refused, was arrested, and fined $14. In response, civil rights organizers, including Martin Luther King Jr., began a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. The boycott lasted over a year, and while that was going on, a class action suit against the bus company made its way to the Supreme Court. In this case, Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court again used the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to declare segregated buses, like segregated schools, are unconstitutional. Although Little Rock and Montgomery were great successes, segregation remained legal in most places. Martin Luther King believed he had to show Americans and the world how bad racism still was in the South before the federal government would act. Therefore, he decided to lead a protest in one of the most segregated cities in the country, Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, segregation was not only legal, it was required. Less than 10% of the black population could vote, professional jobs were reserved for whites, and there were dozens of unsolved murders and bombings against African Americans. The Birmingham campaign lasted nearly a year. It began in 1962 with a series of nonviolent boycotts, demonstrations, and protests against local businesses. The idea was to create a situation so difficult that the city would have to negotiate. A few white businesses changed their policies until the city threatened to close any business that did not follow the segregation laws. Organizers then decided they needed to be more confrontational. A series of protests were conducted in the spring of 1963 in which Martin Luther King and many others were arrested. Police dogs were used against the protesters this time, but their violence received little national attention. A controversial decision was then made. School children would be used for the next demonstration. What is now known as the Birmingham Children's March started on May 2, 1963, and lasted until May 7th. On the first day, 1,200 students were arrested, and by the fourth day, 2,500 protesters were in jail. To try to stop the marchers, the fire department used water hoses and the police used attack dogs. Pictures of students being knocked down by fire hoses and bitten by dogs shocked many Americans and caused national embarrassment. While not everyone agreed with allowing children to protest, the actions of the Birmingham city government forced Washington to start talking about desegregation and guaranteeing every American's civil rights. On May 8th, white business owners agreed to most of the protesters' demands, but desegregation was slow and violence and resistance continued for months afterwards. Several buildings were bombed, including a church, the hotel Martin Luther King was staying in, and the house of King's brother. In addition, the governor of Alabama sent troops to prevent black students from going to white schools. After Birmingham, Martin Luther King helped plan a march on Washington, D.C. to demand civil rights and equal rights in education and employment. The idea of marching on Washington to demand equal rights was originally proposed in the 1940s by a black labor organizer named A. Philip Randolph. In 1941, Randolph used the threat of such a march to get the government to outlaw discrimination in the defense industry. Randolph then did the same again in 1948 to pressure the government to desegregate the armed forces. Now, 15 years later, on August 28, 1963, 250,000 people participated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This march would become one of the most iconic events of the civil rights movement. At this demonstration, Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he imagined a world free of racial discrimination, where one is not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A world in which everyone would be free at last. In response to the march, early the next year, the 24th Amendment was passed. This amendment outlawed poll taxes. Later that year, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was also passed. That act outlaws all segregation and other forms of discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. President Lyndon Johnson signed the bill on July 2, 1964. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not the end of the civil rights movement because it did not address all the problems with voting rights. Protests and other activities such as voter registration drives continued throughout the country, particularly in the South. Attempts to register black voters in Selma, Alabama, where less than 1% could vote, led to attacks on organizers and protesters. After one protester was shot and killed, a march from Selma to Montgomery was organized. The first march took place on March 7, 1965, and became known as Bloody Sunday, when 600 marchers were attacked by police with clubs and tear gas. During the second march 2 days later, 2,500 protesters were prevented from crossing a bridge by police. The third march started March 16th, but this time the marchers were protected by 4,000 soldiers and federal agents. The violent reaction to the Selma marchers caused President Johnson to demand that Congress write a strong voting rights bill. Congress quickly created the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The act prohibits any practice to deny the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. President Johnson signed the bill into law on August 6, 1965. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks attended the signing ceremony. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required 9 states, as well as political districts in additional states, to get federal approval before changing any voting rules. This need for approval was determined by a formula explained in Section 4 of the Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court declared Section 4 to be unconstitutional. The 5-4 decision argues that the section, last updated in 1982, did not properly reflect the current conditions in the country and would need to be updated by Congress for Sections 4 and 5 to be put into effect again. As of 2021, Congress has not updated the Section 4 formula. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were followed by the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Also called the Indian Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, this act outlawed discrimination in the sale, rental, or financing of housing. In 1988, the law was updated to include people with disabilities and families with children. In 2008, the United States elected its first black president, Barack Obama, and re-elected him in 2012. While Obama's election is seen by some as a sign that racism has become less of a problem in the United States, others argue that events during and since his presidency show racism and discrimination remain serious problems in the country. The Civil Rights Movement ended official discrimination and made it more difficult for individual forms of discrimination. However, the ultimate goal of the Civil Rights Movement has always been guaranteed equal rights for all Americans. In that respect, the movement still continues today. Some current issues include equal pay for women, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, criminal justice reform, and health care as a civil right. This is the end of Section 3. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 48. There are 4 amendments to the Constitution about who can vote. Describe one of them. You don't have to pay to vote. One amendment outlaws poll taxes, meaning you do not have to pay to vote. A second amendment about who can vote allows a male citizen of any race to vote. A third amendment allows any citizen to vote, both men and women. The last amendment allows any citizen who is 18 or older to vote. Question 85. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? Fought for civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for civil rights and worked for equality for all Americans. This is the end of Lesson 4.